Become part of the change towards a regenerative future. Our aim is to promote self-empowerment and educate our course participants about regeneration, so that people all over the world can redesign their communities. Look deeper inside our programs and courses to find your way within your community to transform the world. Sustainability is at the heart of all of our courses and projects. Sustainability design education is our mission. Join our programs, support us, and let's fly together.
Welcome everybody. Well, my name is Silvia Di Blasio, and I'm representing Gaia Education today in this conversation on resilience. And we're really honored to have today Jeremy Lent. Jeremy has run 3 courses with us already, right? The same course 3 times. Mm-hmm. The deep transformation, how we call it. And Jeremy has been an inspiration to many. So in a time when things seem to be becoming worse in the world, and we're not longer talking about preventing or stopping things like climate change, we are actually going into something called resilience. How we make sure that communities and individuals become more resilient and also transform their lives, because that transformation still needs to happen. So with that introduction, I would like you to hear more about Jeremy. Jeremy, can you tell us a little bit more about what you do and your plans? Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely, Sylvia. Thank you. And a lot of my work in the past, some people may know me from books that I've written. I wrote a book some years back called The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, which looked at the ways in which different constellations of cultures made meaning out of the universe, all the way from hunter-gatherers to the present day, and looked specifically about how that meaning making and the values actually shaped the course of history. And then more recently, I wrote a book called The Web of Meaning, which actually a lot of that book's themes are in the course that Sylvia was mentioning on Gaia Education, which basically looks at a different way of meaning making. It's available to us right now, a truly integrative way of making meaning. The book is called The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. And a big theme of the book is that the way our dominant worldview tells us everything works is not just dangerous and driving us to this path of collapse, but it's just wrong scientifically. It's just been way outdated. And so it shows how modern science points the way to the same deep truths of the great wisdom traditions of the past, of our deep interconnectedness. And once we begin to look at the world from that way, we begin to make sense of it in a different way. And that also shifts how we act in the world. So that's what I've written in the past. Right now, most of my time is dedicated to literally where that thinking takes us to, like, how do we envision a different way of seeing a future that could be truly life affirming. And so I'm actually writing a book right now on this vision of an ecological civilization, which maybe we'll talk about at some point today. And the book's working title is Ecological Civilization, How We Can Create a Flourishing Future, which obviously relates a lot to our topic today. And so I'm working a lot on that, and also have initiated a global community, a worldwide community called the Deep Transformation Network that we can also talk about, which again is how it's really the focus on everything is looking at how we can actually transform things towards a positive future. So that's by way of introduction. Back to you, Sylvia.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you for sharing all the different ideas that we're going to be discussing today and all the things that you're doing. So as I mentioned at the introduction of this webinar, this is part of something that we call resilience conversations, and we have had some conversations already, some of them practical about what to do with water and how to take care of water, which is life. Or what to do with food and things like that. Some of them have been part of the course Design for Resilience. Some of them have been public, like this one. So the main idea of the questions to you today are around the fact, like I mentioned before, that the perception of people are changing into something quite negative. A lot of people are losing hope that there will be some meaningful change happening, or at least that it will happen fast enough to, outweigh the negative parts. Then, the negative issues that are already happening, like wars. We're seeing an emergence of more wars in the world. We are seeing an emergence of more governments that are authoritarian, or are making decisions that are counterproductive if you think about things like climate change or injustice. So they are actually going back, to decades ago in terms of rights for the people, or rights of the environment. So with that environment, sometimes it's difficult to continue, and sometimes it's difficult to believe that something is really, I wouldn't say that it's not going to happen, but that is going to happen, fast enough and big enough, right? I do believe, like you, that the changes need to happen in the heart and in the mind, not just the individual, but the community. So they need to happen at the worldview level, or like you say, a transformation of the culture. So in your experience, in your research, what you have seen that has happened and what is possible? Can you share a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that one thing I've seen from when we look historically is that there are only really a few times that we see in history, really, where the whole meaning making of a culture actually shifts or actually transforms. And, there's that happened really the first time in the human experience was when we went from spending basically 95% of the human species history as nomadic hunter-gatherers to settling down into agriculture. And that led to a transformation, one of the sort of big cultural transformations of worldview, from seeing the world as sort of like a giving parent, which nomadic hunter-gatherers did, to seeing the world as this hierarchical set of authoritarian structures where you had to sort of sacrifice to the gods and kowtow to the chieftain, etc. And we saw a couple of other big shifts, transformation towards a dualistic worldview in the West, and then the rise of the scientific revolution around the 17th century or so that's totally transformed our lives in the last few hundred years. And what we see really is that we can think of this meaning making as really like a coherent, self-organized system, which is very resilient. Like in ancient Chinese culture, for example, you basically have the same worldview lasting for well over 2,000 years. And obviously it shifted a little bit, it elaborated, but it was the same way of meaning making. But this is what's interesting. When something, what happens to cause a worldview to shift? Either something happens internally, which begins to transform from within. And we can see that like in the scientific revolution in Europe, where a new way of thinking made its way, which was revolutionary at the time and began to like change everything from within. Or it can be what's called an exogenous shift, or like coming from externally, which is what happened exactly in China. What caused the Chinese worldview to change after over 2,000 years? It was basically the humiliation that the whole Chinese empire and culture received from the West, and gunboats in the West and the Opium Wars. And basically, the West systematically just destroyed Chinese culture. But when that humiliation took place, new generations of young Chinese people growing up looked at their parents' worldview and said, this is a bunch of bullshit. It doesn't make any sense. And they could no longer take the authority from their parents and accept that. So they looked elsewhere. What other worldview? And of course, the logical worldview to turn to is the Western one, because that seemed to be successful. And they're the ones who were dominating. So then in China, you see a shift towards actually more like a Darwinist kind of survival of the fittest type worldview at first. And then they took another Western idea, essentially, of communism or Marxism, and sort of rejiggered it really into sort of Maoism. Then they turned to capitalism in the last 30 or so years and came up with their own version of that. But the point is, and the learning from all this, as we need to understand, is that right now, our global civilization is undergoing some of these shifts, causing another transformation. And really, some of the shifts are both internal and external. So we can think of the external shifts as basically Gaia, or like the world system itself, basically doing like the West did to China, but the sort of global ecological system doing that to our civilization, saying this is not going to work anymore. We're looking at climate breakdown, and not just climate breakdown, but ecological devastation in so many layers. So it's really important not to get stuck on climate, even though it's the most obvious and pressing and urgent situation. But we need to look at global heating, almost a little bit like a person who's suffering from a high temperature. And that can be itself very dangerous, and you need to treat that. But you're being kind of silly to just say, oh, let's treat the temperature without looking what are the underlying conditions that cause that in the first place. That's what needs to be done. So that's one set of factors. But then internally, like you were mentioning, Sylvia, the rise towards greater oppression, incredible inequalities, the rise of authoritarian governments, the contradictions of this internal system of global capitalism that basically is just based on growing and turning all and everything, nature and human beings, into resources for exploitation. That is a system that can no longer continue in the way it has. And so internally, we're looking at more and more people doing just like the Chinese younger generations did, generations back, saying, we don't take this bullshit anymore. We're going to look for other ways of making sense of things. And that's really, to me, one of the core sources of where, to the extent that there is a reason to have hope for where we can go, where that arises, because younger generations of people growing up in this world that is unraveling are looking for what is a different way of making sense of things. That's where I feel we have an opportunity.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm seeing that, and I'm also seeing the opposite. So some, as we know, in systems, things emerge, and not everything what emerges is good or will lead to an improvement. It's like in nature, some of the things we are the ones who put the moral, how do you say that? We put the moral value, whether something is bad or wrong, right? But in nature, we see things decaying, right? Or exploding, or disasters happening that are actually emergences, or something as a reaction of, what it was happening. Like you say, the entire earth and our ecosystems are reacting to the abuse and to the exploitation of resources. Mm-hmm. So same with youth and with everybody, not just youth. We're seeing a lot of people going into the direction of, we need to change this. These are the things that we're going to be doing. and actually pushing for those changes, which is
Right.
really great. But we are also seeing a lot of apathy and despair, and people getting into things like addictions or numbness,
Yes.
some sort of numbness that
Hmm.
just denies everything what is happening because it's too painful to
Hmm.
face it, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
that leads me to the question about resilience. What exactly is resilience for you? The way that we try to see it in the course Design for Resilience is instead of bouncing back, bouncing back like
Hmm.
the usual resilience definition, we are trying to use the bouncing forward.
Yes.
How we can create the conditions for the emergence to go into a direction that we
Hmm.
want and not to another direction, and how we can create conditions if we expect that things are going to get worse in certain areas, how we can create conditions so people and ecosystems are at least have the tools to
Hmm.
navigate that and to get to the other side,
Hmm.
right? So what would you suggest there?
Yeah, these are great questions, Sylvia, and I really want to make sure to make it clear that I'm very, very happy and glad to share my own experience of working with these questions. But I don't claim to have all the answers. I think anyone who does claim to have all the answers on something like this, you need to really be very cautious about hearing. And so I can share my own internal ways in which I've navigated these issues. And I think, one core navigation really is between the sense of like sort of hope and despair when we look at what's going on. And this in itself is really a complex issue. Like hope itself is one of these words. Everyone starts to define it in different ways. And there's a danger to trying to look at the positive and saying, oh, well, at least this is a possibility, and look at this as a hopeful sign, etc. And some of the dangers around that are, one, that it can cause us at a sort of almost like semi-conscious level to kind of avoid looking at how bad things are, because we don't want that sort of glimmer of hope to get submerged by when we look at the devastation of the people getting, like the mass killings taking place in Gaza, or similar things that aren't hitting the news, like in places like Sudan right now, and so much else, and so much devastation. And then stuff that's closer to home that many of us just only have feeling around us. So that's one danger about that. And the other danger about focusing on, well, if we can get this done, let's work on this particular project that might happen, is that a lot of the time, given that there is this onslaught of destructive systemic processes going on, many of the things we work on to try to make something better fail. And even if they don't fail, maybe we end up a little bit of a success, something we want to celebrate. But then when we look at the big picture, it's like, oh my God, such a tiny little sliver of a positive thing when so much else bad is going on. I see these things myself very clearly. And a lot of the time, I will have within myself a voice or a part that basically is the voice of like leading towards despair. Like, when I'm looking at something positive and celebrating something with somebody, there's this voice that comes in saying, you got to be kidding. I mean, look at what a tiny little positive thing this is compared to all this devastation going on. And, and so even if we have thousands of people joining together in a community looking at something positive, then you sort of turn your eyes to what's out there and you realize there's hundreds of thousands or millions of people joining authoritarian parties and just buying into this whole notion of racism and keeping out undocumented immigrants who are like suffering. So all this terrible stuff we see happening. So I think we need to be very aware of that. And one of the things that's been most helpful for me is actually a whole series of practices from internal family systems. It's a growing psychological practice, which also we can think of in terms of what's called parts work, which basically is just a process of recognizing each of these parts within us and recognizing that all of us has parts that want to be hopeful, and parts that feel despair, parts that want to numb out, as you were saying, Sylvia, and all those. And turning to those and not saying any of them are bad, or trying to overcome them, or trying to ignore them, and saying, but actually honoring each of them, recognizing every one of those parts has actually emerged within us in our own internal systems as a way to try to protect us one way or another. None of them are actually bad in themselves. They might, if allowed to dominate what we do, they might lead to actions that aren't so helpful. So, but the way to be with them is, first off, I think first and foremost, with kindness, with like approaching each of those parts with an internal sense of kindness, and then honoring, hearing what they have to say. And then once we've heard what they have to say, and this is the process I go through pretty much almost every day, it's like I hear those parts, and I hear that part of me that feels despair, and I can respond to it in using more sort of cognitive ways, which I do. I mean, I'm somebody who is very much a cognitive, I think a lot about what's going on in the world. And one of the approaches I do is look at, there's a sense of this inevitability, like we're headed towards collapse, we're headed towards destruction. It seems so obvious when you just look at the lines in the graphs and see where it's leading to. But then what's helped me a lot is a recognition of how complex systems work. And when we look at any complex system, and our total global human culture, like the whole global culture, probably the most complex system we know of. So all these billions of each brain is the most sort of complex entity we know of in the world. And you put 8 billion of them together in this incredibly complex system, and then look at the interaction of that with Earth systems. There's no way anyone can actually predict. Now, the scary side is no one can actually predict how or when, how close collapse is. We don't know if our total civilization collapse is going to happen in the next few years. We don't know that. We also don't know if we're actually going to be unraveling bit by bit towards a collapse that might happen decades from now. We don't know if we're going to be moving into more like a Fortress Earth type scenario, where rather than a total collapse, the elites basically cordon off, their elite parts of the world, and most people endure a horrendous collapse while they're off, maintaining their technologies. None of those, which, by the way, I see as, from a moral standpoint, is even more egregious than a collapse itself, for the elites to go ahead and do that. And I feel that we need to be aware of that. That's probably what a lot of the people in those elite places are secretly kind of figuring that will maybe happen. But we also don't know if the possibility exists of the kind of internal transformation that could lead to a fundamentally transformed society. Now, none of us can put probabilities on that. But the thing that we do know is that each of us, any of us who has the privilege to basically look at this situation and still have choices. There are many people right now who are so suffering the onslaughts of what this dominant system is doing. They don't really have a choice to do anything other than get up and live the next day, and find food for their kids, and find food for themselves, and just deal with climate disasters, or deal with all kinds of social economic disasters coming their way, or military attacks. So the people who are suffering that, they don't have that choice. But a lot of us are still in the world, especially people in the global north, and people who have the ability to look and see what's going on, have degrees of freedom. We have a certain privilege around that. And what we can do with that privilege is actually take what energy we have and turn that towards that possibility of what we can do to transform the world into a better future. And one of the things that kind of helps me when I look at that possibility is, like, imagine, for example, like you're a person who's in a dark room where there's no source of light, absolutely black, absolutely bleak and dark, except there's a maybe like a screen, like a computer screen, and just a couple of pixels of light suddenly come up on that computer screen that you wouldn't even notice. They'd be so tiny in a normal room, you wouldn't even notice. But in that total darkness, that's what everyone who's in that room can see. And the notion of that is, as the world gets bleaker, which it's getting, as the world gets darker, by maintaining those beacons of light, those possibilities, those recognitions that we can bring what we have, we can bring kindness and compassion, and in terms of our internal ways of relating, the way we relate to others around us, and the way we bring our energy into the world itself, those can be even more powerful than before, as long as we can maintain that within ourselves. So those are the ways in which I relate that to my own beings. And essentially, ultimately, where I come from is just really a recognition over the years that developed in me that basically I think it's true for each of us. And I'll just talk about my own experience, but it's true for every one of us who's alive, that it's not just life is out there and here's me and what do I do if I see it being attacked. I am life. Life is this ongoing, incredible, almost magical system that has been unfolding on this earth for billions of years. And one of the amazing things is, here I am, a conscious person. Life has manifested in me. I am life. And in that sense, what I can do, what I can choose to do every day is give myself to life. And what that means is basically taking any skills, any particular capabilities I have, and looking how can I use that to serve life in the best possible way. And it may end up being for naught. We may end up looking at total destruction, but we may not. And because none of us know, it feels to me like every one of us has that imperative from life itself to give ourselves to what's possible.
Thank you, Jeremy. Wow, a lot of ideas here, and I want to kind of take each one of them, because each one of them are super important. Well, the first that I recall is your own practice of accepting all the pieces inside of ourselves, and acknowledging and honoring that we can be feeling despair, pain, frustration, anger, all those things. At the same time, we can be feeling, hope and inspiration and, eagerness to be part of the solution, and so many other things. And all of those things are okay, because all of those things are part of ourselves. So acknowledging that, whether you call it internal family systems, or whether you call it, World Reconnects, which is another practice that, allows us to accept and honor all those things, and maybe doing it not just on your own, but also doing in community, sometimes in groups. It becomes much better. Another thing that you mentioned was the recognizing how complex systems work, and that reminds me something that Fritjof Capra said. When he was recently, he had a question about one participant of the course, about the same thing, how young people can be, inspired or willing to do anything with collapse in front of them, right? And he said something that is very simple, and at the same time is the response to these. In a way, I know that you say that nobody has the final response, but this response actually comes from life, not from Fritjof.
Right. Yes.
He just said, and it's the fact that life is, internally is regenerative. Like life fights for life. Life creates the conditions for life. So what that means in a complex system is that, yes, you will see destruction and collapse happening, but you will also and always see life fighting to be alive. Right. And I love what you say, that those of us who have different levels, because we share different levels of privilege, we still have choices. So if we have choices in front of us, it's a responsibility for us to how we want to use those choices, right, in front of so many who don't have choices.
Yes. I think that is very, very true. Sylvia, and I love that life sets the conditions for more life, and that is, as Fritjof says, that's exactly how life works. And I think what's also important is, a word that I generally, even though it seems like it's an important word, but I kind of stay away from it. I'll explain why in a minute. Is that word like we have a responsibility? Because I think we do actually have a responsibility, but I also sense that a lot of people will take that notion and recognize the validity of it, and then that becomes a burden on them, and then that can lead to these sort of guilt syndromes, like, oh my God, I'm privileged, I have a responsibility, and I'm not doing what I could be doing, and so and then you feel bad about it, and then it begins to create this internal loop. You don't want to feel bad. So that's when you begin to numb out, or that's when, or maybe you do some simple little thing that actually isn't making that much of a difference, but you'll make sure you use your reusable straw or whatever, or like you go, well, I'm doing my bit. And then you'll sort of make that part feel better or whatever. So the important thing is to recognize those internal kind of little loops that we have within us. And when we recognize that, again, this to me always comes back to the same thing of this starting with kindness, not then saying, oh, I'm screwing myself up, I'm not, but actually recognizing those are things that we do. And when we treat them with kindness internally, and things like practices like meditation, to me, are invaluable for that, because in the noise and day-to-day activities of the world, it's very difficult to notice those different parts within us. And when we sit and give ourselves a real time for quiet and reflection and non-judgmental awareness of ourselves, that enables us to begin to notice those things. And when we're not being judgmental, we can notice them and then move towards something else. And one of the things that I feel, I've sort of gotten the sense, is that it's a lot to do with a sense of identity. Like if I sort of say, well, I am this separate person and I've got this privilege and the world's out there and people are suffering, but I should do something about it, then that causes these loops. When you begin to actually feel into that your identity itself is part of our community, part of all of humanity, or part of all of life, as you begin to really feel into that, when these things are happening out there, it's no longer out there. It's like within me. Once I really truly get the sense that I am life, in the words of Albert Schweitzer, this great thinker of the 20th century, I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. Once that really becomes internalized, when things are happening that are destroying other people's lives or the lives of other living systems, we feel it in ourselves. And when you feel it in ourselves, it no longer becomes like, oh, it's my responsibility to do something about it. It's like just the same way that if somebody starts to hit you, and you don't say, oh, I'm being hit, I'm hurting, I guess I should stop that. You respond because it comes from within you. And it's what you want to do, not what you feel you should be doing. And I think that is what's so critical about that, is that it's a way to take the energy, that sense of suffering that we feel around us, and then turn that skillfully into action. That to me is one of the most crucial sort of practices to sort of feel into, like sensing ourselves as sort of these energy systems and asking, well, if life is within me, and life being this kind of something so much greater, so much, and the internal wisdom of life is in each of us, what does life want each of us to do in terms of how we relate to all that suffering? And from that, there's an important distinction to be made, which you'll get the relevance of this in a moment, but between what's called empathy and compassion. Like a lot of the time in normal language, we use those two words interchangeably. We don't notice much difference between them, but they're actually very different. Like empathy is when I feel the suffering of another. And it's a fundamental part of being human. It's this wonderful aspect that enables us to connect with people. But it's painful. When I empathize with somebody else, I really feel it. And while that is an absolutely essential part of our humanity, it can also lead to the wrong kinds of behaviors. If I feel too much empathy, that will cause me to shut down because it's too painful to feel the pain of others. And it can also lead to a sort of more parochial way of relating. So if I feel the empathy of somebody who looks like me, and then I see them being attacked by somebody who doesn't look like me, and so that empathic sense of shared suffering with somebody can lead to then actually othering those who seem to be the ones causing the pain or whatever. So these are things to recognize. But compassion is or more like a skillful way of recognizing the suffering of others and holding it and being aware of it in your consciousness, but rather than feeling it through and through all the time to bring you down, and actually taking that and moving that towards an intention to use whatever power you have to alleviate the suffering in others. And so if we expand that distinction, that empathy, compassion distinction, to look at all of life, what I've done this kind of deep exploration myself in practices, asking what does life really want for me in terms of how I relate to the suffering out there. And what I've ended up really feeling that I've heard life saying to me, essentially saying to like life wants me to feel the pain of what's going on enough to be energized, to want to do something about it from the core of my being, not because I should, but because that's what I want to do. But not so much that it leads me into despair, or not so much that it makes me feel helpless, and not so much that it just leads me to anger and just pushing out or whatever I say, but actually to feel and to let that infuse through my being, and then let my whole self, basically, including intellect, including a sense of self-awareness, who I am in society, etc., say, what is it that I can now do? Each of us has a different, can ask that question, come up with different answers. How can I take my own unique capabilities and skills with others and help and work with others towards making the most positive difference in the world today? And that's where I feel community gets to be so important, because one of the mistakes that our dominant culture tells us is that we are separate individuals. And that can lead oftentimes to this kind of hero approach to everything, like, oh, I'm going to have the answer. Here's the answer. This is what we need to do, which then leads to a new sense of despair, because none of us actually can make the difference by ourselves. So then we feel so puny, then we can say, oh, forget it. There's nothing I can actually do. But once we begin to look to where we can connect with others that are gone through the same feelings themselves, and looking at their own way of engaging, we become empowered, and we become actually part of something bigger. And so when something is causing me to have a difficult day, I can turn to the kind of group dynamic and feel I'm part of something bigger. So that's okay. We can carry each other along towards that a better future.
Thank you. Thank you. And I like what you say, because it fits into, when people, activists or people who want change and who, take that responsibility of making change happen in the world or in their communities, it's very usual, like you say, that we tend that either towards ourselves as guilt or burnout, right? Or feeling completely disappointed and frustrated when things don't turn out how we expected. Or we can turn into blaming or shaming others, judging, whether others are doing enough or not, or whether they're doing the right things or not. So thank you for turning that into, that extension, that expansion of ourselves as part of life, and connecting with others, connecting with nature, and just relaxing in or surrendering into that, because we don't have to carry everything on us, and we are not necessarily right all the time. So thank you for sharing that. I would like to turn now to some questions from those attending. We have been seeing some questions here and there. one person was asking, what is the difference between sympathy and empathy? I think that you made a very good differentiation between empathy and compassion. I don't know if you want to talk about that particular question. There was another person asking about the emergence and the things that are emergent that are quite negative. How the emergence helps. I think you quite answer that with your comments, but I don't know if you want to make any comments on that. All these emergence that we are seeing on the world. I mean, not the world, the war on Gaza, on Ukraine. The governments,
Yes.
against people and things like that. How that,
Yeah.
I wouldn't say help, but because it doesn't help obviously, but that polarization,
Yeah.
how we can contribute to alleviate that.
I think that's a great question. And yeah, something
Mhm.
really important to explore. So thank you, Roberto, for asking that question. And yeah, I think this again is an ongoing issue. It's one that I don't think there's like a simple answer to it, but I think that it's like a process of how we navigate it. That we do see this incredible extreme polarization, and first around the Ukraine, but what's happened now with Hamas and the terrible events of October 7th, and then this horrendous overreaction from the Israeli government and authorities causing this mass killings in Gaza. This is something that has led to this terrible polarizing trauma really throughout the world. And I do think it's incredibly important for us to look at that. And one of the things we need to realize is that when we see, it seems so obvious, I think to many of us, it feels obvious to me, like there's a side that's right and a side that's wrong. But oftentimes to just stridently go out and just say, that side is so bad, and it might make me feel better for a few minutes. And, maybe people in my own sort of tribe or my own followers on Twitter or whatever might say, yeah. But what I'm doing is actually adding to the polarization. But then it leads to this question. The vast bulk of people listening to this right now are going to be really on one side of that sort of political divide. And if we extend it to go beyond the Gaza situation, just the polarization, say, in American politics or politics around the world, between you've got these more and more authoritarian leaders and authoritarian groups getting more support. And oftentimes I and many of us will look at this and say, how can they do that? How can they be part of these things that are so harmful? And that leads to this othering, which again can, in the short term, make us feel a bit better. I'm on the side of good and they're on the side of bad. But it can only lead ultimately to the same polarization that actually ends up supporting the very people we're trying to fight against. Because when we look at what we're actually trying to work towards, it's not we're trying to be on the side of the progressives against the side of the reactionaries. What I believe most of us are wanting to do is actually help to move forward this recognition of our deep interdependence with each other, and a sense of shared compassion and a sense of shared identity of all humans together on this earth. And so even if we were to be successful, if suddenly some sort of magical wizard came along and gave all the progressive people some extra power and extra force to just win the elections and do all that stuff, if we actually did that through this continuing of polarization and saying those people are bad, they don't understand what they're doing, we haven't actually achieved anything positive. It might look like we might get a few better legislative victories happening, whatever, but ultimately we cause then counter reactions. People who feel like, oh, I lost, I'm going to get back, we're going to do something else around it. So what is crucial, I think, the way that the most radically transformative and powerful way to approach the polarizations is actually to pause for a moment, to look at what that person that you are feeling against in terms of the political arguments ever, where do they actually coming from? And actually find the deep, deep layers of connection that we have with that person we're arguing against. And I can say this. I'm not saying I'm the best, most successful in doing that myself. Oftentimes when we're with family or whatever, that's when we have our biggest challenges, and somebody who's just got totally different points of view, and we don't end up being the source of light. But at least what I'm putting out is an intention for myself and also for all of us as we enter in these kind of conversations, that you don't actually win a conversation through argumentation and saying you're wrong for this reason, that reason. And even if the other person ends up saying, okay, well, I'm not going to talk to me, they go away, they're entrenched in their position. Again, you might feel good for a minute or two, that's it. The way that what you can do is connecting, hearing, listening deeply. What is it that person is not just saying at the top level, but what are they hurting from underneath? Where are their source of suffering? Where is their desire to be part of a group that gives them a sense of comfort? And what ultimately do they want? Because virtually all human beings, with the exception of a few people who are truly psychopaths, which is a tiny percentage of humanity, virtually all people, even the ones who are leading these terrible regimes doing so much harm, actually they want deep down the same things that we all want. They want to feel love. They want to feel safety. They want to feel secure. They might have taken turns in their life where they are so far from those deep desires, they don't even realize that. But when we can connect with people around us in that way, we can begin to move towards a more positive future together. And a lot of what that means is in a conversation with somebody, just a day-to-day conversation where we're disagreeing with somebody, rather than try to win the conversation, to try to leave the conversation with that other person feeling heard. That other person saying, oh, I thought that progressive son of a bitch would never actually listen or care about what I said. They really heard what I meant. And leave that person feeling maybe a bit curious about something that might cause them to open up their own thinking to a little bit more. So not try to change their mind in one conversation, but opening them to curiosity, to want to explore something different. That's the way that we can, I believe, overcome some of this terrible polarization we're experiencing now. It's slow work, but it's work that it can actually be, just like we were saying about life before, setting the conditions for life. It's work that can actually end up feeling good in our own hearts. So it doesn't actually take our energy away. We can actually end up feeling more connected and feeling that we are helping to move our larger sense of identities together in a positive way.
Thank you. I like that. I love that, leaving the person, with that idea of, that you actually listen to them instead of discussing or fighting, or trying to convince anybody from, about anything. And that curiosity, because curiosity, well, once I read that, people who are not curious usually are become very static in their ideas, right? So open that curiosity, and the best way is when you allow people to lower the the protection, right? So that they are not reacting to everything what you say. We're approaching to the
And I
end.
would just say, sorry to interrupt, Sylvia, before you move on, just on the notion of curiosity, as important is to be curious about ourselves, and to be curious, say in that kind of conversation I was just describing, or anytime, to be saying, oh, I wonder what is in me that is so want to hold on to this idea or won't let go of this. And so just as much as trying to leave the other person curious is leave ourselves curious. And really recognize we've all got more to learn, and also that we are all embedded in these structures of oppression, that a lot of us might recognize and want to fight against it, but also recognizing ways in which we actually ourselves, through our normal activities, are causing some of this oppression. Being curious about that too. So anyway, I just didn't want to.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. Yeah.
Back to you, Sylvia.
Yeah. No, perfect. And thank you because that reminds, the same thing that you say at the beginning, that compassion to ourselves, and listening and accepting all the pieces in ourselves that we tend to reject, remembering that we are also socialized in that way. We are socialized in a way that we separate things, put them in compartments instead of keeping all together. So thank you for that. Like I was saying, that we are approaching the end. So I want to talk a little bit about two things. One is because you have been talking so much about the importance of changing ourselves from the inside, and also our own communities from the inside. Because it doesn't matter, you can make political changes, economic changes, social changes, but if you don't really believe and act, with that in mind, well, it's not gonna change. So I want to share, for those attending and those who will be watching the recording, that we have two courses coming up that will, help people to navigate into that. One of them is actually starting very soon on the 25th of March, and is the we call it the worldview dimension, and where we explore the reconnection to nature, practices, and also we explore how is that our minds became that way, the perception that allow us to, for one, part, to develop all these science and all this technology, but on the other side, hurt the environment and our society so much. And in September, I think it's September 28th, right, Jeremy, that we start with your course, which is an amazing course, 10 weeks, conversations with you, exploring all the roots about why this happened, how this happened, and what are the choices that we have right now in front of us. Do you want to talk a little bit more about your course, Jeremy?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that invitation, Sylvia. And so this course, which, as Sylvia mentions, has been actually given now, I think, about 3 times through Gaia Education, and has left people really feeling transformed in very powerful ways. It's actually called Principles and Practices of Deep Transformation. And the course does trace a lot of the work that I've put out there in the books I've written and am writing right now, that I talked about at the beginning of this conversation. And so it looks at, really, it starts off with some of the themes from my first book, The Patterning Instinct, looking at how we make sense of the world through our patterning instinct, basically, that part of our human brain that causes us to make meaning out of things. And by recognizing the ways in which we do that, and the ways in which it's been done historically, kind of frees us up to begin to look at other ways of meaning making. And a big portion of the course looks at basically the great sort of existential questions that pretty much every human being asks at some point in their lives. Things like, who am I? Where am I? What am I? How should I live? Or even, why am I? And in every one of those, the course looks at how our dominant culture answers those in ways that are just plain wrong, coming from early scientific reductionist ways of thinking that have been superseded. And it looks at how, when we begin to answer those questions using what findings in modern systems thinking and complexity science, evolutionary biology, and tying that in to the great wisdom traditions of Taoism, Buddhism, indigenous wisdom, we begin to answer these questions in profoundly different ways, and leading to the last few sections of the course, which actually looks at this possibility of an ecological civilization. When we begin to answer these questions culturally and as a community collectively, we begin to start to explore how can we actually set the conditions for basically all people to flourish on a regenerated earth. And when we start to look at that, we see what's actually possible for a far, far different life-affirming future ahead of us.
Thank you. And it's an amazing course. I enjoyed myself. I took myself first, and I really invite you all to attend to that course. Jeremy, you two other things. I know that you have a community. I would like you to share a little bit about what it is that community about and how people can sign up.
Sure.
Yeah, and the book. I know that you're writing another
Thanks.
book, so I'm
Absolutely.
very
Great.
excited
Thanks.
about that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll just touch on each of those. Thanks a lot, Sylvia. So the community is one that I mentioned early on, just quickly. It's called the Deep Transformation Network. And maybe we can put the link in the chat. Easy to find, basically, deeptransformation.network. And it's a community that actually arose out of courses similar to the one I just described. I would give online a couple of years ago. And when people going through the course, the biggest issue by the end was like, how do we stay connected with all the other people that we've been sharing these ideas with and wanting to build a sense of, we're not wanting to lose that community. So the Deep Transformation Network basically is a global community, which now is numbering close to 4,000 people who have joined it in the last couple of years, of people who recognize a lot of what we've been talking about today, who recognize that we are headed, the world is headed towards a devastating future, and who recognize that what we need is not just incremental changes, but deep transformation of our global systems, which also leads to deep transformation within ourselves, and sort of essentially decolonizing our own minds to be part of that real transformation. So we have online feed conversations about articles or whatever, but we also have monthly live meetings where we'll often have panels talking about people who are engaged in active, like fantastic groups doing really positive things towards deep transformation. We learn about them, we interact with them, ask questions, and we'll have other live meetings. And we have lots of subgroups where people can go really deep into exploring other aspects of what deep transformation means. So great community. And oftentimes when people recognize what is going deeply wrong in the world, it can be a very isolating experience, because suddenly you're beginning to see things differently from your family or your co-workers or the people around you. And many times people join this community and they go, oh, great, I finally realized I'm not alone in trying to make sense of these things. So that can be very empowering. And the book I'm working on, as I mentioned the title of it before, is a book about an ecological civilization, which is an exciting process. Actually, I did a couple of years of research on this book, because what the book ultimately is looking at is recognizing that if we are going to transform our civilization to one that's truly life-affirming, it means every aspect of our civilization has to start from a different basis. But when we look, so we're talking about everything from like education to urban design to technology to governance systems to agroecology, you name it, every aspect of our life. And what is so inspiring is that people have already, in every aspect, have already been doing the thinking of what it would look like to have a different way of organizing that domain of society. So what I'm really trying to do in this book, having done this research and finding what is out there, is kind of putting it all together, showing that it's actually the idea, the possibility of a fundamentally different civilization is not just some utopian, wouldn't it be nice if type of thing. It's actually doable. It's actually a coherent, meaningful alternative. Ultimately, the only thing that is stopping us from going from where we are now to there is, one, is the shared vision of what's possible, and then the embedded forces of oppression that are stopping us from happening. But once we begin to get a sense of what's actually possible and realize that there's millions of movements basically around the world actually moving towards that same shared possible future, I think that can be a real energizing catalyst to where we can move forward. Thank you. Thanks, Sylvia.
Thank you. I think that's a great way to end. But I want you to respond to one last question. If you were sharing with people one thing that they can start doing or continue doing for resilience, this week, what would that be?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think really what comes to my mind is what I mentioned earlier, is set a deep intention in yourself to be kind to the parts within yourself that are resistant, or the parts within yourself that you feel you need to overcome that are bad, to start with that kindness towards those parts within yourself and encourage them to be part of that bigger part of who you are. And then from that practice, once you begin to develop that muscle of turning to those things with kindness in yourself, and really start to explore what it's like to turn to the people who you see as your opponents, enemies, or people with views you can't stand. What happens if you actually turn with that same kindness to what they have to say and what they're feeling? And that, to me, is the magical alchemy of what ultimately leads to full resilience.
Thank you. That's a beautiful way to close. Thank
Yeah.
you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Always loving having you here.
Yeah, thank you for a great conversation. Really love talking with you today. Thanks.
Okay, bye everybody, and be kind.
Bye.